This is the Enjoyer Podcast. I'm your host, James Dixon.
Pop quiz. Does the name Ossian Sweet mean anything to you? If you're an enjoyer of Michigan and the gun culture of Michigan, it should. He's the reason we say today that a man's home is his castle. Castle doctrine originated in Michigan and segregated Detroit 100 years ago. In 1925, 4 decades before MLK, Dr. Ossian Sweet had a dream that he could go wherever his money would take him, that he could use the fruits of his labor to buy the best home he could afford, not whatever was available to him in the neighborhoods where blacks were allowed to reside. And so Sweet bought a home on Detroit's east side at 2905 Garland, off Charlevoix and Cadillac, in a white neighborhood. It didn't take long for Sweet to meet and hear from his new neighbors. They did not bring sugar cookies and good tidings. What they said was they didn't want to live near a black man, and they were not the least bit shy in saying so. It's unthinkable to talk like that today, but a century ago, people would say these things in the newspaper. We've come a long way this past century, but how often do we frame it that way? Rather than take stock of how blessed we are to live in these times, these tolerant times, people go off in search of microaggressions so they can LARP and pretend that they're as discriminated against as an Ossian Sweet, as a Rosa Parks, as an MLK, and not that they're blessed to be here and now. Or they make the other mistake and they study history to learn every story of the downtrodden. They try to pretend that that person's pain is their pain. Well, I have bad news for you guys. History is not a kind place. No, my grandfather was not offered, like your grandfather might have been, a 0% interest loan to buy a home in Livonia in the 50s. But yes, I could live in Livonia right now if I so chose in the 20s. As Willie Beeman said in Any Given Sunday, life ain't fair and fair ain't what I'm here for. The arc of history bends in one direction, toward people doing what we do now, which is treat each other better than any group of humans who've ever shared a planet. We should give ourselves credit for that sometime because it's kind of cool. Back to Ossian Sweet. As the Detroit Historical Society explains, Sweet quickly sensed that he and his family would not be welcome in their new home. What'd he do? Call the cops? Cops wouldn't have helped him. No, he fortified his castle. He loaded up his house with close friends and guns and waited for trouble to come, and soon it did. And when the trouble did come, in the form of a mob gathered outside the Sweet home, eventually somebody inside 2905 Garland fired a shot, and somebody outside 2905 Garland was hit and died. Sweet and everybody else in the house was charged in the murder case. In court, Sweet was represented by Clarence Darrow, a Michigan law grad who's widely considered the best trial lawyer in the 20th century. When the case came to Wayne County Circuit Court, it was heard by Frank Murphy, who would go on to serve as mayor of Detroit and eventually on the U.S. Supreme Court. As a plaque at the old Frank Murphy courthouse explained, Murphy instructed the Wayne County jury that a man's house is his castle and that Dr. Sweet had the right to defend it if he had good reason to fear for the lives of his family or their property. Those rights, he noted, belonged to black people as well as whites. This land is your land, this land is my land, and we will protect this house as we are allowed under the law and under our God-given rights to do. You've heard that a man's home is his castle. Well, somebody had to fire the first shots to establish the case law. It seems like common sense today that the Second Amendment would and should apply to all Americans, but 100 years ago, that was closer to a groundbreaking sentiment. And so the reason Ossian Sweet matters a century later is the precedent his case set. That a man's home is his castle has been elevated past law to idiom status. So obviously true, how could anyone doubt it? But someone had to utter those words first, and some circumstance had to bring on that occasion. The American idea of freedom owes to two things: the First Amendment, free speech, and the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. Back when I was a kid, if someone said something and you didn't like it and you complained about it, it was common that they would respond with, "It's a free country." When's the last time you heard that? We should bring it back. And there's our Second Amendment, our right to bear arms. Human history shows that in countries where people have lost that right to bear arms, to defend themselves, atrocities soon follow. Remember, nobody wants to disarm you for your own good. They do this for their own good. A disarmed people can be forced to take jabs they don't want. Disarmed people can be made to pray 5 times a day while facing the pride flag. But people with guns, they're not quite so easy to bully. And that's what makes America America. We can say whatever we want, and if people try to stop us, we can fight back. When foreigners attack the American idea of freedom, those are always the targets: First Amendment and Second Amendment. They say that the pen is mightier, but from what I can see, the enemy sure seems to fear both. That's why I'm excited to meet my guest today as I bring guns into my portfolio as a journalist at The Enjoyer. Brenden Boudreau is Executive Director of Great Lakes Gun Rights. Brenden, welcome to the Enjoyer podcast.
Thank you, James. I'm glad to be here. Glad to be on your show. I appreciate it.
Now, who is Brenden Boudreau, and what would you have people know about Great Lakes Gun Rights?
Sure. Yeah. So I've spent over 9 years of my career in politics working to advance the right to keep and bear arms across the country. I spent 9 years at the National Association for Gun Rights, helping pass constitutional carry laws in more than a dozen states. I set up Great Lakes Gun Rights back in 2015 and started working on that project here in Michigan then. I was instrumental in getting constitutional carry introduced in the Michigan legislature for the first time back in 2016. And we were successful in actually getting it passed out of the Michigan House of Representatives in 2017. Of course, things took a turn with the election of Governor Whitmer. But the fact is that Michigan is in the minority now. Michigan is one of 21 states that does not have a constitutional carry law of some form on the books. We have very restrictive gun control laws on the right to carry and the right to bear arms, and it got worse, obviously, in 2023. Our goal is to undo all that the Democrats have done, and then some.
Roll back.
Yeah.
Brenden, what makes the gun unique as a weapon? Why does it need to be protected, and why is it so targeted?
Yeah, well, some famous dead person once said that a firearm is the great equalizer. It puts parties on the same playing field, and we think about who benefits the most from the right to keep and bear arms. It is the weak and the minority, those who are at a physical disadvantage, or those who are in a population disadvantage in terms of whether it be by race or by political view. Individuals who have the right to bear arms, as you've already stated, are harder to subjugate. They're harder to put under the rule or to force them to do things that they would not otherwise do. History is awash with examples of people being tyrannized and people being conquered when they've been disarmed. So the right to keep and bear arms, it is a fundamental right. It is based on the biblical principle of self-defense, the ability to defend oneself and their family. These rights predate the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution established the protection. It put restrictions on the government, the government's ability to restrict the right to keep and bear arms. So, of course, we talk about the Second Amendment. When the founders gave us the Second Amendment, they had not just gone deer hunting. They had just liberated a nation from the British Crown. So when you look at it into its historical context, it's laughable to say, well, it's just for self-defense or just for hunting. No, actually, it's to fight tyranny, ultimately.
Absolutely. And I think about, the Aussie and Sweet case. So you got, 8, 9 guys inside a house, 8, 9 guns. Not a ton, but without the guns, that's not nearly enough guys. There's 100 people outside the house. And so what is that equalizer? How can 10 fight 100? Guns, because gunfire is going to scatter people and it's going to scare people, and you won't have to fight all 100. A lot of people are just going to want to leave. And so I think, when you think about how far we've come in that century, even back then it was understood. How am I going to fight this battle? I didn't want to fight my neighbors. I don't want a mob outside my house. But whether it's angry white people that you're moving into their neighborhood, or it's Black Lives Matter in 2020 marching down your neighborhood and demanding that you raise a fist, and if you don't, that gun is your equalizer.
Yeah, absolutely. It was once said that an armed society is a polite society, and you think about how true that is. There's great statistics about this when comparing the United States to other nations. For example, in the United Kingdom, where firearm ownership is heavily restricted to the point that it's almost non-existent. Statistics show that the number of hot break-ins, as in when people are home and a violent criminal breaks into a home, is a much higher rate than in the United States. It's common sense why that is, because in the United States, there's a likelihood of someone having a gun behind that door versus in the United Kingdom, they're not going to be armed. And actually, the law is written in such a way, talking about stand your ground and castle doctrine. The law is written in a way where criminals have more rights in the United Kingdom than they do here in the United States.
And so whenever someone talks about that European idea of freedom, I always have to ask, well, what do you mean? What do you mean? I mean, the American idea of free speech is itself unique. I mean, in English common law, it was said that the truer the negative statement about somebody, the truer it was, the greater the libel. And so that's just not how we think. We say truth is the ultimate defense. And so that's just a clear difference in how we view things. The British seem to think that what you do when your home is under siege is you call for other men who may or may not be armed to come help you, as opposed to you handle the threat yourself.
Yeah, it's wild, that comparison, because of course, gun control advocates, I like to just call them gun banners, because that's really what they are. They've been more honest about it of late.
Oh yeah,
they always like to point to Europe and say, well, Europe doesn't have gun violence, but guess what? They still have violence, and in many respects, it's higher rates of violence. They just like to ignore certain kinds of violence and narrow in on gun violence specifically, instead of looking at knife violence or physical violence, or of course there are illegal firearms in these European countries, and the ownership of them is skyrocketing. I mean, you think about the United Kingdom is an island nation. How are firearms getting into the United Kingdom illegally? And of course, the criminals have the guns, but the citizenry does not. And how is that turning out for them?
What do we always say in America? That if you outlaw guns, only outlaws will have guns.
Yeah. And of course, the gun banners like to just sugarcoat that. Well, we just haven't passed enough gun laws yet. We need to pass more gun control laws. And whenever that comes up, they never ask the question of, well, maybe the gun laws that we've passed have failed and we should repeal those. It's all about control. They want guns to not exist. And of course, that's a utopian ideology that's not based in reality.
That's John Lennon stuff.
And they ultimately
heard Garth Brooks singing about that and Imagine, and no Glocks too,
Yeah, exactly. It's a utopian ideology. It doesn't look at the human condition correctly either. The fact is that I am a Christian. I'm vocal about my faith. Man was born in sin and has a proclivity towards sin in the unrepentant heart. And all you have to do is look around you and recognize the truth of that statement. That ultimately the founding fathers, when they founded our republic, they were trying to restrain the passions of man because they knew that man was inherently sinful. And that's ultimately why the right of self-defense is so critical, because of the sinful passions of man. We have to have the ability to defend ourselves and our family against those who would do us harm, or our nation for that matter.
And, you know, I think about the feminist retort used to be teach men to not rape, as if people are taught to rape, as if people are taught to commit violence. No, these things are always going to be part of human nature. Our earliest stories as a species involve these things. I mean, the third guy in the Bible killed the fourth guy in the Bible. You can't possibly think you're going to eliminate that from human nature. So what you need to do is account for human nature in your laws. And in that sense, I love your perspective, because you have a national background, so you understand the national sweep and kind of where we sit within that. Is Michigan considered? I think we would all sit up here like as a novice and think of our state as gun friendly, because almost everyone I'm the only male in Michigan who does not own a gun personally. Everyone else owns a gun except me. And so I think of us as gun friendly, our culture, but relative to other states, are we gun friendly or gun hostile?
No, we are gun hostile. It's gotten worse. I like to give this example of my sister who moved to Arizona almost 20 years ago now. And when she got there, she tried to figure out how to register her handgun. And the people laughed at her. We don't have that. Yeah, we don't have that here. Wow. Michigan's draconian pistol registration scheme, it's not even a true registration scheme, but it's an outcropping of the 1920s and frankly has racist roots. Not that many states have a form of registration. Michigan does. We have a purchase permit that was just expanded to include long guns. You look at our permitting. Yeah, that was done in 2023. So, because that's the way that they pass universal background checks, quote unquote. Because they didn't like that, people were privately selling long guns, shotguns, Of course, they used the Michigan State shooting as justification, but what did the Michigan State shooter use? He used a handgun.
Yeah.
And he was ignoring all the laws on the books. But this is what gun grabbers do. They use a tragedy and they exploit it for political gain. And they try to grab as much power as they can and expand the power of the state as much as they can. But you look at our concealed carry laws. To carry concealed without a permit in the state of Michigan is a 5-year felony. Assaulting a police officer to the point that they need medical assistance is a 4-year felony. So carrying with a coat without a permit in Michigan is more heavily penalized where there is not a victim than assaulting a police officer. In California, yeah. If you don't have it correctly stored in your vehicle. Yeah.
People don't know this. You can go to jail and prison in Michigan for having a conversation wrongly, for being pulled over and either not having a CPL or not telling the officer you have a CPL and are armed.
Yeah, or if you don't say it in the right order, because even the state law on that is not 100% clear. I mean, what are you supposed to do when you get pulled over? You're supposed to roll down your window and yell, "I have a gun" to a cop.
Right.
That's not going to go well for you. Our duty to inform law is outrageous. Our carry laws are crazy. As a comparison, I have this national perspective. In California, it's only a misdemeanor to carry without a permit. So
Holy
Michigan
cow.
is worse than Michigan. Last I checked, anyways. But you look at Michigan. Michigan is an outlier in so many ways, and you look at all the ways that Michigan gun laws interact with one another. And we haven't even started talking about Michigan's red flag gun confiscation law, which that's been a hot mess coming to surface lately. But even the ability to carry to defend yourself, Michigan's permit system is the fourth most expensive permit to get and obtain in the country. So it's an outrageous amount of money. But of course, you can openly carry, but then the act of open carry is difficult to do in Michigan because of the way that they've written the laws.
When did this happen? Like what is this something that happened during the Whitmer era, or has the Overton window been kind of tilted against guns for whatever reason for some time?
Yeah, so it actually happened in the 1920s.
1920s.
Michigan's purchase permit law and concealed carry laws come out of the 1920s. It's actually one of the oldest permit systems in the country, one of the oldest registration systems in the country. It predates Hawaii. and New York's registration schemes. And the history there, we like to think that we're this enlightened northern state,
Right.
but Michigan has a, when it comes to its gun control laws specifically, has racist roots. And that's an uncomfortable truth for Democrats, that they just kind of like to shade over that. And of course, if you look at where do most of the CCW charges happen in Michigan, concealed carry of a weapon happen, Wayne County.
Right.
And how does Wayne County handle that? They throw the book at the men who are getting charged with these CCW charges. I mean, this is life destroying stuff. If you don't pay the fee, mother, may I have my permission to carry, which, it's expensive. It's expensive to go through the training. It's expensive to get the permit. And the statistics show that the training doesn't actually even make a difference when it comes to safety. You still got to buy the gun and
buy the ammo.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just that they're trying to make it prohibitive.
Yeah. And so if you don't, though, you can end up getting a felony. And we all know how that works out for people.
Right.
For something that should, in 29 states, you can do without a permit. Michigan, you can go to jail for 5 years if you don't get the permit.
And also, Wayne County is the most violent county in Michigan. So you can't even protect yourself. Like, so you want to carry a pistol. It's taking too long to process it. You live in a dangerous area. You're supposed to literally wait until they do process it.
Yeah.
It's just, it works against the interests of common sense and public safety.
Well, during COVID, they conveniently stopped processing them.
Yeah.
Too.
Everyone's working at home.
Yeah.
Interesting. That actually surprises me. I would have thought that Michigan was much more of a gun positive culture because, I was looking at the Michigan State Police stats, and in our 83 counties, something like 60 of them have one homicide a year or none involving guns. And so obviously, the Wayne counties, the Kent counties, those numbers will be different. Genesee County, those numbers will be different. But I think we're making policy for the 10 million based on the crime involving the 600,000 in Detroit.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and even to your point, I remember before the 2022 elections, it was not looking good for Republicans. It looked like they were going to lose everything. And I remember telling me, they'll never pass gun control here in Michigan. We're too pro-gun of a culture. We have a gun culture. And I've been doing this long enough to see what Democrats do as soon as they get complete power. They actually use the power, unlike Republicans who like to swindle it away far too often.
Mm-hmm.
And there are, sadly, during that gun control fight in 2023, I mean, I was in Lansing for almost every week for like 6 to 8 weeks on end, just constantly there. Go there to testify against bills. They wouldn't let us testify. Anyway, that's a different story. But the amount of people who thought that it wouldn't happen, that means they didn't care. They may not have even voted. And they probably didn't contact their lawmakers. And then in the midst of it, I had people saying, well, why even bother? They're going to do it anyways. I'm like, you're talking out of both sides of your mouth. The way to control politics in any state in America and at the federal level, I mean, politics is a numbers game.
It is.
Politicians do the math. They determine how many voters can I make angry before I'm going to lose my job on an issue, and that's what it is. I mean, ultimately, before 2018, before that election went sideways, getting constitutional carry through one chamber of the Michigan legislature was a big deal. At that time, there was only, I think, a dozen or more constitutional carry states nationwide. So to get it through one chamber, and with Democrat support too, there are 3 Democrats who voted for it. Was a big deal.
Now. Wow.
Oh no, they would not. And heck, I don't even know if we can get all the Republicans on it now, because so many of them after the Michigan State shooting said, well, just enforce the laws on the books. And I had to remind people, well, look at the laws on the books. First of all, are they working? And second of all, we don't support them. Look, we can say that perhaps the individual should not have been carrying, but there's a whole lot of other issues going on there. besides his ignoring of the law. I mean, if anything, that proves the point. The
Right.
law was ineffective, and then
Right.
all it did was further endanger others.
Brenden, you mentioned the racist roots of our gun control laws in Michigan. Which laws are we talking about? And what was racist about them?
Yeah, I mean, I would say arguably, and there's different viewpoints on this, and I'm not as well versed in the history, but whenever a government tries to control who can purchase firearms, there's usually an idea of that they're trying to stop certain people. You look at how permit laws were originally may issue, as in the government may issue a permit. Well,
Yeah, may or may
there
not.
were. Yeah, exactly. So how did they make decisions like that? There were county gun boards where they would weigh all these various things, and it doesn't take long to realize that some counties use that for certain ends to prevent
Right.
certain people from arming themselves. You look at across the country, the Deep South specifically, permit laws were to stop free black slaves from carrying for self-defense. They were trying to stop certain people from having firearms.
Now, you've talked about something, and you had some success many years ago in kind of the early Trump years. And I'm actually shocked that it didn't go further, because Republicans ran the entire legislature back then and the governor's office. What is constitutional carry, and what
Yeah.
is the pathway there?
Yeah, constitutional carry is just a simple concept that if you can legally possess a firearm, possess a handgun, you should be able to carry it openly or concealed without having to get a permit. It's what the founders intended. It's a very basic concept that has gone mainstream now. When I got started in gun politics in 2014, there were only 4 states that had constitutional carry laws.
Wow.
Vermont was the first, which is odd, I know. It was written into their state constitution. You had Wyoming, Alaska, and Arizona. And we were told, many of us were told, that this is constitutional carry is never going to go mainstream. There's too much pressure to keep the permit system in place. The gun lobby, the largest gun lobby in America, was not favorable towards constitutional carry. So that was ultimately weighed against. Well, we talk about the Overton window, right? You talk about the Overton window quite a bit. That's part of it, but also the permitting process ultimately is a added benefit to people who are offering training. So if you're an NRA certified instructor, there's a financial benefit. Now, what's been nice is that we've actually seen studies now where the number of people obtaining training stays either the same or actually goes up after a state removes the requirement to have a permit to carry. Frankly, the number of permits that people get on an annual basis fluctuates on who is in the White House. There's really a close relation to that. But if you keep an eye on that, you compare states that have permit requirements versus states that don't have permit requirements, and if it basically follows that trajectory. So that's why I can say comfortably that people are still getting training regardless, because they keep the permit process in place for reciprocity, so you can go carry across state lines.
Right.
But also, when you remove remove a barrier from something, there's no longer this requirement to have training. That means the barrier to entry is lower, and more people are going to go seek training because they aren't required to do it, and therefore, they aren't being forced to do it, and they're going to do it for their own good. But yeah, so the pathway forward for constitutional carry in Michigan, of course, we've taken a couple steps back here. It's the same as it was before. The way that a constitutional carry law is passed, it doesn't happen on its own. It doesn't magically happen when people out of the goodness of their hearts, politicians aren't going to pass it. But it's done by a well mobilized and well activated grassroots, where politicians have to realize that supporting constitutional carry is good politics, and being against constitutional carry is bad politics. And ultimately, it comes down to controlling their political environment, controlling their political career. there have been countless states where you have Republicans who are begrudgingly voting for it because they know that if they vote against it, they're going to lose their next election. And a great example actually in Michigan was Speaker Matt Hall. In his first election back in 2018, he beat a Republican who voted against constitutional carry. And so this is a prime example where the politics of constitutional carry is good in a Republican primary. And, frankly, it comes down to it. It's just good politics in general.
Why not a ballot initiative?
Yeah, that's a good question. The history of ballot initiatives in Michigan are not favorable to conservative causes. They are very expensive, and frankly, the left is better organized than we are, especially on these more controversial issues. There are some issues that obviously, the numbers are better. If you look at public opinion polling on the gun issue, this is where I'm thankful that gun rights are determined by public opinion polling. The numbers are against us. Of course, a lot of that has to do with the way the questions are worded. John Lott has done a great study on this, where if you frame it in a way of, do you believe that guns should be taken from dangerous people? Who's going to say no to that? But if you explain that, well, in the process, there's not going to be due process, and those individuals, and not everyone that is going to be subject to red flag orders is necessarily going to be a bad person, and they're going to have their rights stripped away from them. The questioning matters. That changes the numbers dramatically. But as we know, the left lies, cheats, and steals their way to get what they want. And in a ballot measure, you're talking about basically a multi-million-dollar. I mean, we saw how much they spent on the abortion ballot measure, $40 million. And my guess is you'd probably have maybe not as much as that, but you'd have tens of millions of dollars against it. Whereas if you look at through the legislature, you're talking about a couple of election cycles away where, the gun rights community makes it clear that we want constitutional carry. We get a bill introduced in the legislature. We work with them to push the bill forward. Ultimately, what we want is a vote. We want to vote on the House floor, on the Senate floor, so we can see where people stand on it. And then we get to hold people accountable for how they vote on it. That's difficult in Michigan, admittedly, but we have done it before. In other states, we've gotten multiple roll call votes. But the point is that you want politicians to get used to supporting the issue, and those who are against it get used to losing on the issue. And again, Michigan is so wishy-washy. 2026 rolls around and Republicans take everything.
Yeah.
Who knows? If we do our job well, we in the grassroots and make it clear that we want constitutional carry, and certain politicians lose their jobs over it and others get elected on that issue, all of a sudden we have a new reality. That's why we keep pushing, even when it's not going to pass right now. You keep pushing because you're moving that over to win.
What happened in 2017? Republicans ran all of Lansing. They could have done this. Why didn't they do it?
Rick Snyder, he was opposed to it, and Arlen Meekhoff was carrying the water for him in the Senate. And Rick Snyder told Meekhoff, I don't want it. And of course, Rick Snyder supported red flag laws, so he came out in support of those near the end of his term. He wasn't a pro-gun governor, and I think we knew that. But frankly, the other issue that you have too is you have a lot of Republicans who get bloated ratings from the gun rights community for doing nothing, doing nothing or being harmful to the Second Amendment, but because these certain gun rights groups have relationships with these politicians, they'll give out bloated ratings and say, "Oh, you're our friend. We love you," even though you voted to stab us in the back. And that, it's like a child that misbehaves. If you give a child that misbehaves a cookie after they misbehave, what are you going to get more of? You're going to get more bad behavior. And it's the same thing with politicians. If you let politicians get away with voting against your issue, and in fact you reward them for it, you're going to get them to vote against your issue more because you're not perceived as a threat. look, the left plays this game. The left is more effective than the right on this. But this is what we have to do. And that's why I look at Lansing right now. I'm like, some of them have fighting spirits. Other of them are scared of their own shadow. We don't want to rock the boat too much because, we'll lose our majority. It's like, well, you lost your majority in 2022 because, frankly, you're kowtowing to the Democrats too much.
There was no point in having them with the majority back then. That's what people don't get. When you cave, when you sign 1,000 laws with Whitmer in her first term, people start to think, why the hell not just have actual Democrats in office if you're going to do what Democrats want?
Yeah,
now, it turned out Democrats were worse than anyone could have actually imagined, and we had to learn that one the hard way, that there is a difference, and that even a bad Republican is better than a good Democrat. But I look at that Snyder era and just say, man, imagine having all that power. He didn't even want right to work.
Yeah, he had to be forced into it.
You know what I mean? It kind of had to be brought back of like, okay, you said if the union did this, you would do that, but it was not pushing for it. And so I want to ask you about this, a tale of two infringements that somehow have become accepted and mainstream in Michigan, but I just don't see how they jive with the Second Amendment. First one you mentioned, red flag laws. Detroit News had a story recently about this. 321 of these emergency risk protection orders in the first year. How did we get here? And what's the path forward to sanity? Is it repeal? Is it federal court?
Yeah. How did we get here? Red flag laws became the new gun ban lobby soup du jour. It was like 2017 that this really started coming to the surface. Of course, there are a couple states who had these kind of laws before that. But they started marketing these. Well, this is the solution, and this is the ticket. And the NRA was bad on red flag laws when they first came out. When I was working for the National Association for Gun Rights at the time, who I'm working with again now, and we started feeling like we were the National Association for Due Process Rights, because lost in that, there was always this argument, well, this is a responsible way to take guns out of the hands of dangerous people. And it sounds good on the surface, but as you start peeling back the layers of that onion, the great example is the latest story out of the Detroit News, where they're talking about how they're red flagging 6-year-olds, 8-year-olds, minors, which of course these minors aren't owning firearms. What they're doing is they're essentially doing a household red flag, where they're taking all the guns out of the household. So it's not just the child who is having their due process rights violated, but the whole family.
So by using the child as the conduit, you get the guns out of the house. Yeah.
Which, of course, as you referenced the earlier Detroit News article about how there are 320 articles. The majority of those were ex parte, which ex parte means they were done without the party present. So they had no ability to face their accuser, no ability to defend themselves. A judge signed off on it. And of course, we were told by Democrat Kelly Breen, well, it's a higher threshold of evidence. Not by much. And how many of these ex parte orders were given? And of course, it turns the American judicial system on its head.
Right.
You have the presumption of innocence in the American judicial system. They changed it. Oh, it's the presumption of guilt. And oh, by the way, we're going to take your guns, and then you have to explain why you're not a danger after the fact. Well, how do you prove a negative?
That's what I don't get. And to me, it's an indictment on our public school educated public. I went to public schools. I've only gone to public schools. But I have to think that the point of our schools is to produce the kind of adults who hear, we're going to take guns away from dangerous people, but don't know to ask, who decides what's a dangerous person?
Yeah, exactly.
All I hear is an invitation to corruption and even putting people at risk and danger. If I want, my political opponent to not have the right to protect themselves, and they're walking around more physically vulnerable, we've seen people willing to carry out assassinations for politics. it just goes all down all these bad paths. And then the second one, Brenden, is, and a lot of people like this, I just personally don't even understand it. Felons can't own guns. Now, if I serve my debt to society and I'm out and I can vote, why can't I own a gun?
Yeah.
And if I just came from prison where there's more dangerous people per capita than in the general public, might I then have a need to protect myself, even if I didn't go into prison with that need?
Yeah. You know, what's interesting is that Justice Amy Coney Barrett, when she was on a lower court, raised these very questions about, whether voting rights or right to bear arms is a more protected right. And she erred and said, well, it's the right to keep and bear arms. And you think about the ability, to your point, we hear the word felon and we think of all these nasty people. Well, think of how easy it is to get a felony in Michigan. I already explained to you.
Could mean Donald Trump, as we've learned.
Yeah, exactly. So you could be a felon.
Watered down.
Yeah. The word has been watered down. So you just think, oh, felons, these are all bad people. Mm-hmm. Well, to your point, if you can be trusted back in the general populace,
right, should
you not have your rights back? And you think about, and not to make light of violence, but how much damage can be done with voting? You can strip to force someone to pay for something that you don't want through voting. Mm-hmm. You can vote to take away their gun rights through voting. You can do all of these things through voting, and we're okay with felons having their voting rights back, but they don't have the right to self-defense back.
Am I a Roman citizen or am I not a Roman citizen? Because if I am, I literally don't see in the Second Amendment. I mean, even you look at the 13th Amendment, it says no slavery, but with an asterisk. Yeah. Like you can be made to do work if you're convicted and that kind of thing. I didn't see an asterisk in the Second Amendment.
Yeah. Yeah, there is none. And again, even look at the Michigan Constitution, Article 1, Section 6 is even more clear. Every person has the right to keep and bear arms for the defense of self and state. I might not be 100% accurate on it, but it says every person.
Right.
And so it's very clear. But the thing is that we are years from even that issue coming up. What we're talking about right now is the ability for people to carry in their car, to carry on their person
and their waistbands.
And their waistband. And again, even as we know, Michigan has cold winters. We had a colder winter this year. And if you want to put a coat on, and then we like to call the concealed pistol license a coat tax, because that's all it is. You have to pay the tax. Oof. Or you're going to go to jail.
Yes.
And so, if you don't pay the coat tax, you could go to jail for 5 years. Now, of course, we constantly hear, well, prosecutors rarely go for the full 5 year. Yeah, well, you threaten them with it to get the lesser charge.
I don't
you still
want
ruin their
prosecutors
lives.
having that power to dangle that in front of your face, because at that point they own you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and You also asked about like what else can we do? I mean, ultimately there's the court challenges and this is kind of a touchy subject for me, because there's a lot in the gun rights community who are relying too much on lawsuits. They're just thinking the courts are going to save us. And look, I was excited. I was ecstatic when the Bruen decision came out back in 2022, and there's a lot of hope. But I can tell you 3 years later now, we're all still waiting for them to take up a ruling to smack down every assault weapons ban in America. That should be crystal clear a violation of the Bruen decision.
Right.
So it's a both and strategy. For example, we've had how many election cycles since 2022? 2024, 2022, 2024. It could be another 2 years before we see a major decision on red flag laws,
right,
a major decision on permitting laws, a major decision on assault weapons bans. Hopefully they come sooner, but if you put all your hope in lawsuits and in the courts, you're going to be disappointed. And especially when you could be working on organizing at the grassroots level, where you are organizing in state house and state senate districts, which are much cheaper to do than lawsuits. That's the other thing too. People don't realize how expensive and how much exposure you get through lawsuits. They are not as simple. It is not just I'm just going to file a lawsuit.
Just hire a lawyer. No.
Yeah. There's a lot more to that. And all the while you're spending all that money paying lawyers and paying court fees and doing all this other stuff. How many people in Michigan actually know that gun laws changed within the last 2 years?
Right.
I can tell you there's a lot of people who are surprised by it, of the things that they passed. And many of them didn't realize until they went to go try to buy a gun again. And so now we've got to identify those people. We got to find those people and say, look, if you don't like this, there's something you can do about it. And we try to inform as many people as possible and give the information that they need so they know how their politicians stand on these issues. If you don't like the laws, work to change them. The legislature, it's the deliberative body. I mean, politics is ultimately, politics is ultimately who rules who, right? And if you're not involved in it, politics is going to be interested in you regardless.
Involved in you, yeah.
Exactly.
I think what you said is so important. The problem with court wins, and I think the pro-gay marriage community, we just had the thing with Josh Driver, and he's, going at them and saying, and I think it's easy to attack a ruling like Obergefell or even Roe versus Wade because court rulings don't move Overton windows. And so that can easily be attributed to 9 guys in Washington, essentially voting like politicians, like the politicians who appointed them. Whereas when you can get laws, I mean, you see it now with the civil rights regime. A lot of people don't like the idea that these court rulings fundamentally change the country. And it seems like there's a real risk of putting all the eggs in that basket, because what if the basket breaks?
Yeah, exactly. And that's because the courts could rule against you ultimately.
Right. And now you have stuff on paper that you don't want on paper.
Yeah. Look at Obamacare. The conservatives back in the day were convinced that the Supreme Court was going to strike down Obamacare. And guess what they did? They didn't.
They found a way to not.
Yeah. And we have to realize
their job.
Yeah, there's not enough people that realize that the Supreme Court is a political body, just like the other 2 branches of government. They are politicians. They politic. They wear robes instead of suits when they're on the bench. And ultimately, they make political decisions. They make decisions on how far-reaching they want to go with their decisions. And that's like the Bruen decision. We can say, yeah, the Bruen decision was great. Practically speaking, it hasn't done much for us yet. And that's,
that's how we have to understand it, is the Supreme Court is a 9-member legislature.
Yeah.
Nothing more, nothing less. Brenden, help people understand this, because someone with a novice level of relationship with guns might hear this and say, what exactly why are people bristling at the CPL process? It can't be that onerous, can it? Help people understand what that process is and about how much it costs to legally have the right to carry a pistol in Michigan.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, it comes down to your ability to defend yourself or others. And the question is whether or not the government has a legitimate right to restrict that. Right now in Michigan, and this happens far too often. If you have a concealed pistol license, and I'm putting this in a practical story for you to show you how ridiculous this is. If you're married, you have a concealed pistol license, and you happen to have accidentally leave the gun in your glove box in your vehicle, and your spouse, who does not have a concealed pistol license, takes that vehicle and drives around and gets pulled over.
No.
She then can become a felon.
No.
So practically speaking, that is the outworking of Michigan's gun control laws, is that what in other states is completely legal to have a gun in the car. If you think about your vehicle as an extension of your domicile, that is a felony in Michigan. So ultimately, the question is, when we talk about a gun control law, of course, people with the permitting process, people say, well, people need to be trained. People need to train. Well, how many other rights do we accept it as normal to require training? And second of all, we assume that the government actually knows what is the appropriate level of training. And third of all, usually the government doesn't. And so you have people saying, well, the government only requires me to do so much training, therefore I don't need to get any more training.
Right.
But again, we get down to the basic fundamental question: should the government be controlling how much training someone has to practice the right? Well, especially in Michigan, considering that open carry requires no training.
Right.
You don't have to have any training to open carry in Michigan. So of course, then the controllers will say, well, we need to have training for open carry. Well, no, quite the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
We need to equalize the rights for open carry and concealed carry, because ultimately, for me as a gun rights activist and a gun owner, there should be no difference in how the law treats open and concealed carry. There should be no difference. So, again, it comes down to the practicality. Let's say, we have another outbreak of riots in Grand Rapids or Detroit, and you have to go, in Grand Rapids, you have to go to Helen DeVos Children's Hospital. Your child is sick. You don't have a concealed pistol license, but you happen to have a gun, or someone loans you a gun. Well, that's actually probably a crime in Michigan too.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
So there you've already run afoul of one law, and then you decide, because I'm in fear for my life if I go to downtown Grand Rapids because of riots, and you don't have a permit. Well, now you're running afoul of another law. And again, the question is this actually making you safer? Mm-hmm. Are these laws actually making you safer, or is it making it harder for you to defend yourself and your loved ones? So, you could say, well, I want people to be trained. Look, I want people to be trained too. I just don't think the government should be mandating it, and certainly shouldn't be putting restrictions on a fundamental right, especially when we see no net benefit, no plus to putting these kinds of restrictions on the right, especially when we can point to the fact that in Michigan, open carry is completely legal without a permit and without any training.
I think if the Ossie and Sweet case happened today, they might say, hey, killing the guy's fine. We're Democrats after all. But was the gun stored properly? Did you give everyone a chance to leave before you started firing shots? It's just, how safe is castle doctrine 100 years later with all that's changed in recent years? It sounds like he would have to get his gun out of a locked box and perhaps even load it at that point just to defend himself.
Yeah. Well, what's ironic about Michigan's castle doctrine? It actually was codified in 2006. And you remember who the governor was in 2006?
Jennifer Granholm.
Jennifer Granholm signed it into law. And it was overwhelming majorities. Whitmer was in Senate at the time. She voted against it, to show you where her true leanings are. But this was something that we took for granted. Of course, then the gun control lobby politicized it, and they brought up George, who's the guy, George Zimmerman, and said that he had a license to kill. Trayvon. They said, he had a license to kill, and which is just an outright lie.
Because they tried to shift it from castle doctrine to stand your ground and make it seem like the two were synonymous. And castle doctrine is also bad too, is what they're saying by implication.
Yeah. What if you think about that, what the implication is of states that don't have castle doctrine, and there are still a couple left, is that you don't have the right to defend yourself in your own home. How crazy is that you have to retreat?
That's the European idea of freedom, and their understanding is that hit a man once, but if that second hit, if that was unnecessary, now I gotta arrest you. It is a very I think about anarcho-tyranny. That's the word that comes to mind when I think of Europe. I think about that time, that video I saw, a migrant, an illegal Muslim there stabbing a guy. A man intervenes to stop him. The policeman arrests that guy, and then the stabber stabs the cop in the neck, and the cop dies.
Yeah, that's a perfect picture of Europe right now.
And that is the future Democrats want in Michigan, where no one has the right to defend themselves. Everyone has to ask for a permission slip. And if you get stabbed in the neck, just the cost of tolerance, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think about the Ossie and Sweet case as kind of a big one in our history, our understanding of the Second Amendment, that it is an American amendment, that this is our land. It's for everybody. Are there any other cases that you think about that kind of shape the way Michigan views and treats the gun?
None that come immediately to mind. I think that there just is in every state in America, there is a disconnect between what is happening in our small towns, even in the big towns, and what's happening in Lansing. Yeah. Lansing is a bubble.
Yeah.
And these people who are elected to represent us, it's an echo chamber there where they think that oh, well, we got to listen to all the talking heads here, instead of listening to the voters back home and what they want and what reality is. And we saw what happened to Democrats in the 2024 election cycle, when they stopped listening to their constituents. They lost majorities in the House. The only chamber that was up, I think the Senate would have flipped too if it was up in 2024.
Oh, I wish it had been.
I know, I do too, because 2026 is going to be a challenge, but Democrats lost because they were more concerned about ideology than they were about actually representing their electorate. And we see the results of that, but at the same time, Democrats had a single majority vote in the House and 2 seats in the Senate, and they wielded power more effectively than the Republicans had in more than a decade.
You would think that they had a 2/3 majority the way they were walking around Lansing.
Yeah.
And the confidence, at least until, it's just so funny that lame duck is when it broke down, because you still had all the power you had on the first day. Still could have done everything you did early on when you repealed right to work, but their inability to get along with each other at a social level stopped them from ruining our state more. It's almost biblical.
Yeah.
Brenden, we'll get you out of here on this one. What do you enjoy about Michigan?
It's a great question. My wife and I lived out of the state for 8 years. Lived in Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio, Colorado, and we decided
a nice taste of the middle of the country.
And we lived in Colorado for 4.5 years, and we decided to move back to Michigan because our family's here. We're originally from Michigan.
Yeah.
I'm from up north. My wife is from the Grand Rapids area. We love this state. It's a beautiful state. We have family here. Our church family is here. I've got family from the Upper Peninsula spending time up there. I mean, it's a wonderful place to live and grow and have a family too. Though we have to be willing to protect it and defend it and fight for it. And I hope that the last 2 years encourage more people to stand up and fight for it as well before we lose it.
I'm glad you said that, because, people have not been shy in pointing out sometimes that, hey, you're the enjoyers, but you're always talking about negative stuff, James. What's up with that? That's because I'm the guy sitting with his back to the wall where I can face the entrance. I'm like Tony Soprano in that last scene at Holston's. I'm listening for the sound of the door opening and looking at everyone who comes through, because these threats are real. And honest to God, we lose 2026. You think we're going to be doing this in 2027?
Yeah.
You think no, we're going to be, should I live in Kentucky? Should I live in North Carolina? And the way I look at 2026, I've called it the ultimate battle, but really what 2026 is for us, it's a loser leaves town match.
Yeah.
Either you save your state and you retain your ability to live in Michigan, or you let the Democrats absolutely ruin this place to where you have to flee it. We might have to get on the CBP One app. We might have to declare ourselves economic refugees and find somewhere else to live out our futures. But this is it. This is it. And so get past your reasons why not and find someone to support. We'll actually get you out of here on this one, Brenden. Where can people learn more about yourself and Great Lakes Gun Rights? And third question I'll wrap in here. Do you have a champion in Lansing that maybe people should try to follow?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can check us out on Twitter and Facebook. Just look us up, Great Lakes Gun Rights, or should I say X now? I still get that one wrong. Check out our website. Yeah, exactly. I did. Not culturally sensitive. GreatLakesGunRights.org is our website. You can get on our email list, and we try to keep people up to date. We want to give gun owners and Michiganders who love freedom and enjoy their rights the information they need to be able to fight and defend their rights. We've got several friends in Lansing who are fighting the good fight. Jim DeSanta, state representative, just filed a bill to repeal red flag. He's a good friend of ours. Over in the Senate, Jonathan Lindsay, Alana Tice, Jim Runstad. Over in the House too, you got Steve Cara, Joseph Fox, Josh Shriver. He's a solid ally on guns too. And there's several others who I know are fighting the good fight to push their caucus to the right on this issue.
Absolutely. Brenden, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, James. I appreciate it.